A teacher thought he could mock history and get away with it, until one student refused to stay silent. Westwood Academy had always carried a reputation of prestige. Rows of brick buildings, manicured lawns, and hallways filled with students who, for the most part, played by the rules. Teachers were respected, lessons followed a structure, and any disruptions were swiftly handled. But on that particular morning, everything took a turn no one saw coming. It was second period. The clock above the whiteboard ticked away as Mr. Leonard Grayson, a history teacher with more than 20 years at the school, stood at the front of the class. He had always been known for his strict demeanor, the type of teacher who rarely smiled, expected order, and had little patience for students who questioned him. His lectures were often dry, but today his tone carried something different. "And that's the thing about these so-called activists," he said, setting his marker down with an exaggerated sigh. His gaze swept across the room. They were dramatic, loud, always demanding something. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, always stirring the pot, never satisfied. A few students chuckled, not because it was funny, but because it felt like they were supposed to. Others sat frozen, their eyes shifting from Mr. Grayson to each other, unsure of how to react. At the back of the room, Jamal kept his eyes fixed on his desk. He could feel the weight of the words pressing down, heavy and sharp. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay composed, to carry himself with dignity no matter the situation. But right now, his fingers tightened against the edge of the desk. Mr. Grayson wasn't finished. His voice grew theatrical, mocking. He started mimicking the cadence of Dr. King's speeches, distorting the words into something unrecognizable, something meant to be funny. Then, shifting his posture, he launched into a dramatic imitation of Malcolm X, twisting his message into a parody. Laughter, hesitant at first, broke out from the front row. A few students smirked, some whispered to each other, but the energy in the room shifted. It wasn't amusement. It was discomfort, thick and suffocating. Jamal lifted his head. Enough. He took a slow breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was wrong. He knew it. Others knew it. But no one was speaking up. He raised his hand. The room stilled. Mr. Grayson's eyes landed on him. There was a flicker of something there. Annoyance, maybe even surprise. Jamal's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the strength behind it. "With all due respect, sir, that's not accurate." A murmur passed through the room. A few heads turned, watching. Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Jamal sat up straighter. Martin Luther King wasn't just demanding something. He was leading a movement that changed this country. He wasn't stirring the pot. He was fighting for basic human rights. Silence. Mr. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't think you understand the point I was making." Jamal didn't waver. "I understand just fine." His voice was steady, measured. He could feel every eye on him, but he wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for himself, for the truth. And that's when the shift happened. A girl sitting a few rows ahead of him pulled out her phone. She wasn't the only one. A few students glanced down, screens lighting up. Mr. Grayson noticed. His expression darkened. "Put those away," he snapped. But the damage was already done. What happened next would change everything. For a moment, no one moved. The room felt like it had frozen in place, caught between the weight of Mr. Grayson's authority and the quiet defiance in Jamal's voice. Mr. Grayson squared his shoulders. "I don't know what kind of attitude that is, but you don't interrupt my lesson with nonsense," he said, his voice clipped, his patience thinning. Jamal didn't back down. "It's not nonsense," he replied, keeping his tone steady. "Dr. King and Malcolm X weren't stirring the pot. They were fighting against injustice, against laws designed to keep people like me from having the same rights as everyone else." A few heads turned toward Mr. Grayson. His grip on his marker tightened. For the first time he looked unsure. Jamal could feel the tension shifting, like the whole class was teetering on the edge of something. Some students who had laughed earlier were now looking down at their desks, their expressions unreadable. Others sat completely still, as if waiting to see how this would play out. Then, from the front of the room, A voice broke the silence. "He's right." All eyes snapped toward the speaker. A girl with dark, wavy hair, her arms crossed over her chest. She had been one of the students who hadn't laughed. Another voice followed. "Yeah, that wasn't cool." Then another. Jamal's pulse quickened. For the first time, he wasn't the only one speaking up. Mr. Grayson's jaw clenched. He let out a sharp exhale, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. He turned his back to the class, scribbling something on the board, as if the conversation had never happened. "Let's move on." But no one was listening anymore. At least 4 students had their phones out now, screens angled just enough to capture the scene. The moment had been recorded. Mr. Grayson turned back, catching sight of one of the students still filming. His face darkened. "I said put those away." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time that morning, he wasn't the one in control. The student hesitated, then slowly lowered their phone. But it was too late. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. Jamal could feel it. The weight of what had just happened. The fact that for once, silence hadn't won. The rest of the class dragged on in an uncomfortable fog. Mr. Grayson went through the motions of his lecture, but his words carried no authority anymore. Students whispered under their breath. Some exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. But Jamal? He just stared straight ahead, gripping his pencil so tightly his knuckles ached. He had spoken up, but the real test hadn't even begun. Because by the time lunch rolled around, the video had already started spreading, and within hours, Westwood Academy would never be the same again. By the time the lunch bell rang, the video had already made its way out of the classroom and into the digital world. It started small, just a few students sharing it in their group chats, a couple of reposts on Instagram and Snapchat. But within an hour, it had spread far beyond Westwood Academy. Jamal didn't even realize what was happening at first. He had spent most of the morning trying to push the confrontation out of his mind, replaying the moment over and over, but telling himself that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't turn into something bigger. But then, as he walked into the cafeteria, he felt the stares. Groups of students whispered behind their hands. Others pulled out their phones as he passed by, their eyes flicking between him and their screens. It was subtle at first, but then, "Yo, Jamal, you're all over Twitter, man." He turned. A kid from his chemistry class waved his phone in the air, grinning. "That video of Grayson? It's blowing up." Jamal's stomach tightened. He hadn't even seen the video yet. His friend pulled up the post. The caption read, "History teacher mocks civil rights leaders. Student stands up to him." Underneath, the video played. There he was, sitting straight-backed at his desk, voice firm, challenging Grayson's words with unshakable confidence. And then there was Grayson, snapping back, looking rattled, losing control of the room. It had already been retweeted hundreds of times. The comment section was on fire. "Wow, this teacher should be fired immediately. Good for that student. This is why people need to speak up. Grayson's been like this for years. My brother had him and he always made slick comments. Finally, someone called him out." And then others, not surprised. This is what happens when you let kids challenge authority. The teacher was probably just making a point. People get offended over everything these days. Jamal exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around his phone. It was bigger than he expected. By the time he sat down at his usual lunch table, his notifications were exploding. His Instagram had dozens of new followers. People were tagging him, messaging him. Some praising him, some arguing, some asking for interviews. Interviews? He locked his phone and set it face down on the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was getting out of control. Across the cafeteria, a group of students huddled together, their heads bent over a phone. One of them, a girl from his English class, looked up and caught his eye. "You're famous now," she said, her voice just loud enough to carry across the table. Jamal forced a laugh. "Yeah, great." But he wasn't sure if it was great. He hadn't expected this. And then, "Jamal." He looked up. It was the principal. standing at the edge of the cafeteria, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Come with me." Jamal swallowed hard, pushing his chair back. His legs felt heavy as he stood. He had spoken up, and now he was about to find out what that really meant. But this was far from over. The walk to the principal's office felt longer than it should have. Each step was heavy, each turn down the hallway filled with whispers. Jamal could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. When they arrived, the principal, Mr. Callahan, gestured for him to sit. Across the desk, his expression was unreadable, neither angry nor pleased. He folded his hands and sighed. "You're aware of the video circulating?" Jamal nodded. "Yes, sir." Mr. Callahan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "This has turned into a mess," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "We've had parents calling all morning. The school board is involved. News stations have already reached out." Jamal sat still, unsure of what to say. Mr. Callahan's eyes settled on him. "I want you to know that you're not in trouble." Jamal's breath hitched. He hadn't realized how much tension he had been holding until that moment. "But this is bigger than just you now," the principal continued. "Mr. Grayson has been placed on administrative leave while we conduct an investigation. There's going to be a meeting tonight. Teachers, parents, the school board. I imagine it won't be quiet." Jamal swallowed. "Am I supposed to be there?" "That's up to you." Mr. Callahan's tone softened. "I won't force you into anything, but if you have something to say, people will listen." Jamal hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a room full of angry parents, teachers, and reporters made his stomach twist. He had spoken up once, but this was different. "I'll think about it," he finally said. Mr. Callahan nodded, as if he expected that answer. "For now, I suggest you lay low. Things are moving fast, and I don't want you caught in the middle of something unfair." Jamal understood what he meant, but he also knew there was no avoiding this now. By the time school let out, the news had already broken beyond the town. A local station aired a short segment on the controversy, using blurred-out footage of the classroom video. Online, hashtags were picking up traction. #fire, Mr. Grayson, Westwood Academy, exposed, stand with Jamal. It wasn't just students talking anymore. It was parents, teachers, activists, people debating whether Grayson deserved to lose his job, or if this was all being blown out of proportion. Some of Jamal's classmates texted him, encouraging him to speak at the meeting. Others warned him to be careful. Not everyone was on his side. And then his mother called. He had barely made it home when his phone rang. He hesitated before answering. "Hey, Ma, what happened?" Her voice was tight, controlled. She had clearly already seen the video. Jamal let out a slow breath. I spoke up. Silence. Then, "I'm proud of you." Jamal blinked. "You're not mad?" "No," she said. "I raised you to stand for what's right. But I need to know. Are you okay?" He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell her he had everything under control. But the truth was, he wasn't sure. "I will be," he finally said. His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We're going to that meeting tonight." Jamal's stomach flipped. No argument," she said firmly. "This isn't just about you anymore." Jamal knew she was right. But walking into that meeting would be the hardest thing he'd ever done. The school parking lot was already packed when Jamal and his mother arrived. Cars lined the streets, headlights cutting through the evening dimness. People stood outside the entrance murmuring, their expressions tense. Some were teachers, some were parents. Others were reporters, their cameras and microphones ready. Jamal's stomach clenched. He had expected a crowd, but not like this. His mother placed a reassuring hand on his back. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," she said quietly. "But if you do, say it with your chest." Inside, the school auditorium buzzed with restless energy. The school board sat in a row at the front, looking solemn. Mr. Callahan stood to the side, arms crossed. A few teachers sat together, whispering, but all eyes landed on one person the moment he entered the room, Mr. Grayson. Jamal almost didn't recognize him. He wasn't the authoritative figure who had stood in front of the class that morning. He looked smaller, his shoulders stiff, his jaw tight. His usual sharp gaze flickered across the crowd, landing on Jamal for just a second before moving away. Jamal and his mother found seats in the middle of the room. Whispers followed them. The meeting started with a formal address from the board president. They were trying to keep things professional, but the tension was impossible to ignore. Then the floor opened for public comments. The first to speak was a woman, a parent. She adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "I watched that video," she said, her voice steady, "and I have to ask, how is this the kind of man we trust with our children?" A murmur ran through the room. Another parent stood. "This isn't the first time he's said something inappropriate," she said. "My son had him 2 years ago. He made jokes about slavery in his class. We complained, but nothing changed." Jamal's hands curled into fists. So this wasn't new. It had just never been recorded before. Then someone else stood. A man in a crisp button-up. His tone was sharper. "Let's be real. This is being blown out of proportion. Mr. Grayson is a respected educator. One comment taken out of context shouldn't ruin his career." Voices rose in agreement. Others shook their heads. The divide in the room was growing, and then Jamal's mother stood. "My son sat in that classroom and watched a teacher mock the very people who paved the way for his education," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath it. "You don't get to decide what's offensive when you're not the one being disrespected." A few people clapped. Others shifted uncomfortably. And then, before he could think twice, Jamal stood too. Silence. Every eye in the room turned to him. His heart hammered, but his voice didn't shake. "I didn't plan on saying anything," he admitted, "but I guess I have to." He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "This isn't about getting a teacher fired. It's about respect, about what we let slide in classrooms, in schools, in this town." He scanned the faces around him. "If I hadn't spoken up, would anyone have done anything? Or would we all have just moved on pretending it didn't happen?" The room sat heavy with his words. And then Mr. Grayson finally spoke. "I never meant to offend anyone," he said. His voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant. "If my words were taken the wrong way, I apologize." But Jamal didn't miss the way he never admitted he was wrong, and neither did the school board. What happened next would decide everything. The school board president adjusted her glasses, looking down at the stack of papers in front of her. The weight of the moment sat heavy in the room. "Mr. Grayson," she said, voice firm, "this is not just about how your words were taken. It's about the fact that they were said at all." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even some who had defended him earlier now looked uncertain. Jamal kept his eyes on the man who had spent years standing at the front of classrooms, holding authority over students who had no choice but to listen. How many other moments like this had gone unchallenged? Mr. Grayson exhaled through his nose. "I have taught at this school for over 2 decades. I have never had a complaint against me until now." A scoff came from somewhere in the crowd. One of the parents from earlier crossed her arms. Maybe that's because the students who felt uncomfortable didn't think they'd be believed. That struck a nerve. Mr. Grayson's face tightened, but he didn't respond. The board president tapped her pen against the table. "We have reviewed the footage, spoken to students and staff, and considered the responses from the community." She paused, letting the tension settle. "At this time, the school board has decided that Mr. Grayson will be placed on indefinite leave while a full investigation is conducted." A few gasps, a few quiet cheers. Mr. Grayson's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Jamal let out a slow breath. It wasn't an outright firing, but it was something. But the real change, that wouldn't come from one teacher being removed. As the meeting wrapped up, parents and students spilled into the hallways. Conversations had already begun. "I never thought about it before, but yeah, I remember things like this happening in my classes too. I guess we've just been letting this stuff slide. What else is going on that we don't know about?" Jamal overheard the murmurs as he stepped outside. The air was crisp, filled with the sounds of people still debating, still unpacking what they had witnessed. His mother walked beside him, arms crossed. "Proud of you," she murmured. Jamal let the words settle. Proud. He had spoken up. And for the first time, people had actually listened. But this wasn't the end. Because one conversation wasn't enough. The next morning, Westwood Academy felt different. The usual morning chatter in the hallways was replaced with hushed whispers. Something had shifted, and everyone knew it. Jamal walked through the front doors, backpack slung over one shoulder, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Some students gave him small nods of acknowledgement. Others looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't been staring. But the biggest change wasn't in the students. It was in the teachers. Some avoided eye contact as he passed. Others gave him a tight-lipped smile, an awkward kind of approval. And then, there were a few. The ones who looked at him with something colder, like he had disrupted the natural order of things. Jamal ignored them. He wasn't here for their approval. When he reached his locker, a familiar voice called his name. Jamal. He turned to see the girl who had spoken up in class that day, the first one to agree with him. She hesitated for a second before saying, "That was brave. What you did." He shrugged. "Had to be done." She smiled. "Yeah, but still, a lot of people wouldn't have." Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A news notification flashed across the screen. The school board had made their final decision. Westwood Academy officially parts ways with longtime history teacher after classroom controversy. His breath caught. Mr. Grayson was gone. No suspension, no investigation. Terminated. For a long moment, Jamal just stared at the headline. He had imagined this moment. But now that it was real, he didn't know how to feel. Relieved? Maybe. Vindicated? Not exactly. Because this wasn't just about Mr. Grayson. It was about the fact that this had been happening for years. And no one had done anything until now. When he looked up, the girl was still watching him. "So, what happens now?" she asked. Jamal exhaled. "I don't know." But as he walked to his first class, passing students who had seen the same news, who had felt the same shift, he realized something. This wasn't just about one teacher losing his job. It was about making sure this didn't happen again. The weeks that followed were different. The energy at Westwood Academy had shifted, and it wasn't just about the empty space where Mr. Grayson used to stand. Conversations had started that couldn't be ignored. In history class, teachers were more careful with their words, more aware of their impact. Students, especially those who had always kept their heads down, began to speak up when something felt wrong. Even the school administration, which had once let things slide, announced a new initiative: mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff. Jamal saw the changes, but he also saw the resistance. There were students who whispered that he had taken things too far, that he got a good teacher fired, that not everything has to be a fight. But Jamal knew the truth. If he had stayed silent, if no one had recorded that moment, if students hadn't spoken up, nothing would have changed. One afternoon, as he was packing up his books at the library, a voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Hey," he turned to see a freshman, someone he didn't recognize. The kid shifted awkwardly, gripping the straps of his backpack. "I just wanted to say, what you did was cool." He hesitated. "I had a teacher last year who said stuff like that, but nobody ever called him out." Jamal studied him. "What happened to the teacher?" The kid sighed. "Nothing. And that was the difference." Jamal nodded. "If it happens again, don't let it slide." The kid gave a small smile, a knowing look passing between them. "Yeah." As he walked out of the library, Jamal exhaled slowly. He wasn't an activist. He hadn't planned to start some movement. He was just a kid who refused to let something slide. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. Silence allows injustice to thrive. Speaking up, even when your voice shakes, can be the spark that forces change. What do you think? Would you have spoken up? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.